My parents stole my future to finance my sister's weddings. I made them pay for it. My name is Ben, and I'm 18 years old. I have two older sisters, Grace, 26, and Lily, 24. If I were to describe them in one word, it would be high maintenance. They love the latest designer bags, expensive lunches, and spending time posting glamorous selfies. They both have part-time jobs but live off whatever people are willing to fund for their lifestyle. Our family isn't poor by any means, but we're certainly not the wealthy type either. My dad, Tom, is a regional sales manager for a medical supply company, earning about $120,000 a year. My mom, Marie, works part-time as a real estate assistant, bringing in another $40,000. They live in a typical suburban neighborhood, where it's easy to get the feeling that people are constantly pretending to be more affluent than they really are. Most of the houses are mortgaged, and luxury cars are parked in every driveway. Growing up, I understood the family dynamic pretty clearly. Grace and Lily were the princesses, getting all the attention, while I was the quiet, responsible one. I was expected to figure things out on my own because I didn't demand the spotlight. Grace was the loud one. Every occasion became a huge family event with all eyes on her. When she graduated high school, my parents threw a party that cost more than some people's weddings. Her college graduation? Same deal, except bigger. When she got her real estate license, they celebrated like she had just become a doctor. Lily, on the other hand, was more subtle in her manipulation. She would cry at the right moments, play the victim, and make everyone feel guilty if they didn't give her what she wanted. It was a more passive-aggressive approach, but effective. I, however, stayed out of the drama. I did well in school without making a big deal about it, worked part-time jobs starting at 15, first mowing lawns, then working at a diner, and eventually landing a job at a local auto parts store where I actually learned some practical skills. I saved every penny, watching my sisters burn through cash like it was endless. By the time I turned 17, I had about $12,000 saved up, nothing huge, but enough to help me out with college expenses or, if I decided to take a different route, trade school. There was one thing, however, that had been hanging over me for years: my grandfather's trust fund. He had set it up for each of his grandkids when I was born, and while the exact amount was a mystery, I knew it had to be a significant sum. Grandpa was a mechanical engineer who worked for Boeing for over 30 years, retired with a solid pension, and had invested wisely. When he passed away when I was 7, he left us trust funds to be managed by my parents. I had overheard conversations over the years that suggested the amount would be enough for a full 4-year degree at a decent school, maybe even some leftover funds. I'd been planning for this moment. I had spreadsheets on my laptop, breaking down costs for college, potential scholarships, and even work-study options. I figured I'd work part-time through school, but the trust fund would cover my tuition, living expenses, and books. My grades were solid, not perfect, but good enough to get into a state school, and I was optimistic. Every time I'd ask my parents for details about the trust fund, they'd give me vague assurances, like, "There's plenty there, don't worry about it, you've got a future ahead of you." But that summer, just after graduation, I realized how wrong I was. I hadn't planned for my 18th birthday to be a big deal. I wasn't into grand celebrations. I'd seen my sisters have their big, flashy parties, and honestly, I preferred something more low-key. I figured we'd have dinner at home, Mom's lasagna, my favorite, and then maybe go out for dessert. It was supposed to be a relaxing evening, with just the family, and the perfect time for us to discuss the trust fund and figure out the specifics. Instead, that night changed everything. We sat at the dining table, and Mom served dinner. She had made my favorite meal, but I wasn't fooled. Mom only made special dinners when she had bad news to deliver. I started pulling out my laptop, ready to show them the college research I'd been doing, and that's when Dad spoke up. "We need to talk about your expectations regarding your grandfather's trust fund," he said slowly. "Expectations?" I repeated, my stomach already sinking. What did that even mean? Mom jumped in with her typical forced cheerfulness. "Well, honey, you know, Grace and Lily both got married recently." She paused as if waiting for me to react, but I had no idea where this was going. Grace's wedding was at a vineyard, and Lily's was at a country club. Those were major family events, and we wanted to give them the best start to their marriages. Family supports each other in big moments like these. My mind was racing. What did this have to do with the trust fund? "They were expensive," Dad continued, as though discussing a casual purchase at the store. "Grace's wedding cost about $85,000, and Lily's came to around $78,000. Plus, we helped them both with down payments for their condos. That's another $40,000 combined." I felt cold all over. My mouth went dry, and I quickly did the math in my head. $85,000 plus $78,000 plus $40,000. They had spent over $200,000 on my sister's weddings and condos. All of that money had come from the trust funds, my education fund. I couldn't believe it. You spent my trust fund on their weddings? I asked, my voice flat and distant. We had to make some tough choices, Dad said, his voice almost too calm. We used portions of all 3 trust funds. It seemed fair since we were helping your sisters during important times in their lives. Fair? My mind was racing. Fair? They had stolen from all 3 of us. But apparently, they thought that made it even. How much is left? I asked, my voice almost a whisper. Dad handed me a folder. He was actually prepared for this conversation. He handed me a statement showing the current balance of my trust fund, $8,472. Out of what should have been around $180,000, there was less than $9,000 left. I didn't know what to say. My entire plan, my future, had just been wiped out. Mom tried to reassure me, I know this isn't what you were expecting, but family makes sacrifices. We thought this would be best for everyone. I couldn't even look at them. I left the table without a word, walked to my room, and closed the door behind me. I wasn't angry, not yet. But I wasn't going to let this go. I wasn't about to let them steal my future without consequences. The first thing I did after slamming my bedroom door was breathe. I had to calm myself down. I wasn't going to make decisions in the heat of the moment. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment argument that would blow over. My entire future had just been thrown away, and the people I'd trusted most were the ones who had done it. I started thinking like I always had, practically. What could I do? What did I need? I didn't need to lash out in anger, I needed to be smart. I couldn't let this slide. This wasn't just a mistake or a bad decision, it was theft. My parents, the ones who had been entrusted with the management of the trust, had used the money for their own purposes. And worse, they did it in a way that undermined everything my grandfather had planned for me. I spent that night researching. I knew the basics of trusts, but I wasn't familiar with the legal specifics. I wasn't a lawyer, but I could figure out enough to understand that this wasn't just a moral betrayal. This was a legal breach. I learned quickly that when a trust is set up for a specific purpose, like education, the trustee, in this case, my parents, has a fiduciary responsibility to ensure that the funds are used only for that purpose. If they didn't, that was called a breach of fiduciary duty, and it was actionable. My grandfather had created the trust in 1998, with specific instructions that the funds were for educational purposes only. He had set up accounts for each of his grandkids, and my parents had been the trustees. The trust was to cover tuition, books, and reasonable living expenses for post-secondary education. Nothing about weddings, condos, or anything remotely unrelated to my future. But how could I prove that they had misused the funds? I needed documentation. I needed bank statements, trust documents, and any other paperwork that could show the money had been misappropriated. So, while my parents were at church the next morning, I took my chance. I went into my dad's office. He was meticulous with paperwork, always had been. The man had a color-coded filing system that would make anyone proud. I spent hours going through his files, trying to find anything related to the trust. And finally, I found it. The folder labeled Estate Robert Sr. It was a treasure trove. The original trust documents, signed by my grandfather, outlining the terms clearly. I took pictures of every page with my phone, carefully documenting everything. Then, I found the bank statements for the trust account. There were massive withdrawals starting 3 years ago, right when Grace's wedding was in full swing. Another round of huge withdrawals came 2 years ago when Lily was planning hers. I pieced it all together, building a timeline that matched perfectly with the dates of their weddings and the condo purchases. My parents had been taking money from all 3 trust funds to fund my sister's extravagant celebrations. And they hadn't even tried to hide it. The worst part? My sisters knew. They both knew, and they had no problem with it. They cooperated with my parents. They were complicit. It wasn't just a betrayal from my parents. It was a betrayal from everyone. They had all known exactly what was happening, and they didn't care. They thought I was too young or too naive to fight back. But now, I had all the proof I needed. I didn't waste any time. Monday morning, I called 5 law firms that specialized in trust litigation. I knew this would be a legal battle, and I wasn't about to lose. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. The first lawyer I met with was a guy named Patterson. He had this sharp office downtown, filled with books and plaques. He looked at the trust documents, the bank statements, and the timeline I had built. After just a few minutes, he leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and gave me the most beautiful answer I could have heard. "This is actionable," he said. "Actionable? How?" "Your parents breached their fiduciary duty. The trust specifically states that funds are for education. They used it for weddings. That's a textbook breach. You can sue for the full amount that should have been in your trust, plus damages. I wasn't sure what to feel. On one hand, I was relieved that there was something I could do. On the other hand, the scale of it all hit me. How much are we talking? I asked, trying to keep it together. Patterson pulled out a calculator. He started typing, punching numbers in rapidly. Original deposit, $50,000. With a modest 6% annual return over 18 years, we're looking at roughly $142,000. You've got $8,472 left. So, roughly $134,000 in damages. I didn't know what to say. $134,000. That was the amount they had stolen from me. And that didn't even include the punitive damages. What about my sisters? I asked. They knew. They took the money, too. Patterson thought for a moment. Potentially, yes. If we can prove they knew where the money came from and knew it violated trust terms, they could be included as defendants. My sisters knew. They knew they were spending my trust fund on their weddings, and they didn't care. They were complicit in every way. I wasn't going to let them off the hook. I wanted them all to face the consequences of their actions. We spent the next hour going over the strategy. Patterson explained that we would file the lawsuit, request all the financial records, and push for depositions. I would have to testify, but he was confident we would win. The evidence was overwhelming. Are you sure about this? He asked, sensing my hesitation. Going after your sisters, too? It's going to make this ugly. That's exactly what I want, I said. They need to understand that there are consequences for stealing. For ruining my future for their vanity. Patterson smiled. All right, then. Let's go to war. The lawsuit was filed, and within 2 weeks, my parents and sisters were served. When my parents were served, I wasn't home. I figured it would be better if I wasn't there when they realized that their youngest son was suing them for $134,000. That afternoon, my phone started blowing up, texts and missed calls from Mom, Dad, Grace, and Lily. They were all furious. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I forwarded all the messages to Patterson. He was thrilled. They're panicking. Means they know they screwed up, he said. For the next few weeks, I watched as my parents and sisters tried to justify what they'd done. My parents hired a lawyer, but he wasn't a specialist in trust law, and he was completely out of his depth. Their responses to the lawsuit were laughable. They claimed that this was a family matter, and that they had used the funds to support family milestones. But when Patterson tore apart their defense with trust law precedents, they had nothing left to stand on. Then came discovery. Patterson requested all documents, bank statements, and communications. My parents tried to resist, claiming it was an invasion of privacy, but the judge wasn't buying it. And then the bombshells dropped. During discovery, we found text messages from Grace and Lily, asking my parents to use my trust fund for wedding expenses. Grace had even texted about using my trust fund for the venue payment, and Lily had done the same for her condo down payment. They knew. They knew exactly what they were doing. Patterson couldn't have been happier. This was the smoking gun. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of preparation and tension. My parents were scrambling, trying to fix what they had broken, but it was too late. The evidence against them was damning. The text messages from Grace and Lily, the bank statements showing the money being withdrawn for their weddings, and the timeline that correlated everything perfectly, there was no denying it. In the meantime, I was getting back on track with my own life. I had enrolled in community college using the $12,000 I had saved up, along with the remaining $8,400 from the trust. It wasn't ideal, but at least I was moving forward. I was working 2 jobs to make ends meet, one at the auto parts store, where I'd been employed for a couple of years, and another at a mechanic shop on weekends. It wasn't easy. I was working 60 hours a week, attending full-time classes, and still dealing with the fallout from my family. But despite the exhaustion, there was a sense of relief. I was taking control of my future. I had always known I had to work hard for what I wanted, but now I was doing it without the weight of my parents' expectations or their betrayal hanging over me. The only thing left was making sure that they paid for what they had done. The depositions began in October. I had already known it would be hard, but I wasn't prepared for just how emotionally draining it would be. Seeing my parents and sisters sit there, facing the reality of what they had done, was surreal. I had to be strong, though. I couldn't let myself fall apart. This wasn't just about the money, it was about accountability. It was about teaching them that their actions had consequences. The day my parents testified was difficult. Dad spent hours trying to justify his decisions. He claimed that he'd intended to replenish the trust fund before I turned 18, but unforeseen expenses had gotten in the way. Patterson grilled him, asking for specifics, but Dad couldn't provide any. All he could offer were vague explanations about market conditions and cash flow issues. Mom's testimony was even harder to watch. She cried through most of it, repeatedly saying that she never meant to hurt me. She claimed that she thought she was doing what was best for the family. Patterson pressed her on the terms of the trust, asking why she had violated them. Her answer was gut-wrenching. I didn't think Finn would mind helping his sisters. I didn't think he'd mind. She had spent $134,000 of my education fund and didn't think I'd mind. My sister's depositions were just as revealing. Grace tried to play the victim, claiming she didn't know where the money came from, that she thought my parents were just being generous. But when Patterson showed her the text messages where she specifically asked to use my trust fund, she went pale and stopped talking. All she could say was, "I don't recall." Lily, on the other hand, took a more defiant approach. She argued that the money was family money, and everyone should contribute to big events like weddings. But when Patterson pointed out the legal terms of the trust, she was stumped. "Those terms are outdated," she said. "Grandpa would have wanted the family to support each other." Patterson asked if she had any evidence that Grandpa had intended for his education fund to be used for weddings. She didn't. Then he asked if she had ever considered paying back the money she knew came from my trust fund. "I intended to eventually," she said, like that made any difference. The judge, Judge Harrison, was a no-nonsense type. She didn't seem swayed by the emotional pleas or the attempts to play the victim. By the end of the depositions, it was clear that my family had no defense. They had stolen from me. They had betrayed me, and they had tried to cover it up. But the most painful part of the whole process was realizing how far gone my family was. They had no remorse. They weren't sorry. They were angry at me for holding them accountable. And I realized that no matter how much I fought for justice, things would never be the same. The trial date was set for March 12th. The build-up to it was agonizing. My parents tried one last-ditch effort to settle. They offered to pay back the full amount over 5 years, with interest, but I wasn't interested in a settlement. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about making sure they faced the consequences for what they had done. "I want them in court," I told Patterson. "I want them to explain to a judge why they thought stealing my education fund was okay." Patterson nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "All right, then. Let's go to war." The trial began with opening statements. Patterson laid out the evidence methodically. The trust documents were clear. The bank statements showed the massive withdrawals. The text messages from Grace and Lily proved their knowledge and intent. My parents' attorney tried to argue that the trust terms were ambiguous, that education could be interpreted broadly. Judge Harrison wasn't having it. She interrupted, asking if the attorney was seriously arguing that weddings were post-secondary education. Day 1 ended with my testimony. Patterson had prepared me for this moment, reminding me to stick to the facts and avoid getting emotional. But when I took the stand and talked about how my life had been derailed because of my parents' betrayal, I couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. The cross-examination was brutal. My parents' lawyer tried to paint me as vindictive. He asked if I was doing this for money or to punish my family. I stayed calm. "I'm doing it because they stole from me," I said. "And I want what's legally mine." The trial stretched into day 2. My parents testified, trying to justify their actions. Dad claimed the weddings were important family milestones. Patterson tore apart his defense by pointing to his own financial records, luxury car leases, country club memberships, expensive vacations. If money was really that tight, why was Dad spending $2,000 a month on discretionary expenses? Mom's testimony was painful to listen to. She cried, repeating that she thought I would understand when I was older. Patterson pressed her hard, pointing out that the terms of the trust were clear. She admitted that she knew she was violating them, but still tried to defend her actions. The most damning testimony came from my sisters. Grace had tried to play dumb, but Patterson had the receipts. Lily was defiant, still refusing to admit that what she had done was wrong. The final day of the trial came, and we were all bracing for Judge Harrison's ruling. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. I had no idea what the judge would decide, but I was hopeful. We had an overwhelming amount of evidence on our side. When the ruling came, I couldn't believe it. We won. Judge Harrison awarded me the full amount I had requested, $134,000 in actual damages, plus $45,000 in punitive damages, and $28,000 in legal fees. The total judgment came to $207,000. And it didn't end there. The judge ordered that my sisters be jointly and severally liable for $89,000 of the judgment, the amount that directly benefited them through the wedding expenses and down payments. The aftermath of the trial hit my family like a financial bomb. I didn't know it would unfold the way it did, but I wasn't going to lose sleep over it. My parents, in their panic, filed for bankruptcy, as expected. Chapter 13, which meant they would have to create a repayment plan. A bankruptcy trustee was appointed to sell whatever assets they had left and distribute the proceeds to their creditors, with me being the first on the list. The house was the first thing to go. They had bought it for $320,000 15 years ago, but after the mortgage, they still owed $180,000. The house sold for $385,000 in the hot market. After paying off the mortgage and real estate fees, they cleared about $185,000. I got my $27,000 judgment from the sale of the house, and it meant they were left with a mere $22,000. They had to take out a personal loan for the remaining balance and moving expenses. They moved into a small rental apartment, 2 bedrooms and about 900 square feet, in a much worse part of town than they had ever considered living before. Dad's luxury car was repossessed when he couldn't make the payments. Mom's leased SUV also went back to the dealer. Now, they were driving a used Honda Civic that was older than I was. It was hard to watch, but in a way, it felt like justice. They were paying for the choices they had made, the betrayal they had carried out. They had ruined their own lives, and I was just ensuring the consequences caught up with them. My sisters were less predictable. Grace, who had always played the victim, filed a motion claiming she couldn't afford to pay her portion of the judgment. The judge wasn't sympathetic. She had a job, a condo that could be sold, and assets that could be liquidated. The judgment stood. Lily, on the other hand, tried claiming that she didn't know the money had come from my trust fund. But again, Patterson had the receipts, the text messages where she had directly asked to use my funds. That argument didn't stand up either. Both of them ended up selling their condos. Grace made a small profit on hers, while Lily broke even. They moved in together into a rental apartment, which I heard about through Aunt Janet. Apparently, they were constantly fighting, blaming each other for the mess they had gotten into. Victoria's marriage was falling apart as well. She had always been the golden child, the one who got everything she wanted. But when her husband, Jake, found out that they would need to sell their condo to pay the judgment, he lost it. They had been planning to start a family, but now their dreams were shattered by the reality of their financial situation. Jake filed for divorce, citing Victoria's lack of transparency before their marriage. Apparently, he had no idea the extent of her financial troubles. Lily's engagement, too, crumbled under the weight of the lawsuit. Her fiancé, Brett, had been planning an elaborate wedding, but when he found out that Lily was now $44,500 in debt from the lawsuit, he called off the engagement. He couldn't marry someone with that kind of baggage, especially when it involved stealing from family. In all this chaos, I remained steadfast in my resolve. My parents tried reaching out after the judgment was finalized. Dad sent me an email, long, emotional, filled with self-pity. He said I had destroyed the family, that I was going to regret this decision. He even tried to appeal to my sense of guilt, asking if I was happy with the damage I had caused. I replied with just one sentence: "You chose money over our relationship when you stole my trust fund. I just chose to get it back." And that was it. I blocked their emails after that. There was nothing more to say. They had made their choice, and I had made mine. Aunt Janet, however, was the one person who supported me. She had always seen through my parents' manipulation. When she heard what had happened, she called me to tell me she was sorry for what they had done. "Your grandfather set up those trusts for a reason," she said. "He wanted you kids to have opportunities he didn't have. Your parents disrespected his wishes. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for holding them accountable." Her words meant more than she probably realized. It was the first real support I had received since everything started to unravel. As I moved forward with my life, the satisfaction of watching my parents face the consequences of their actions was bittersweet. I had gotten my education fund back. The $27,000 judgment that had forced them to sell their house and liquidate their assets felt like a victory. It was hard to take joy in it, though. The truth was, I had lost my family in a different way long before I sued them. I had lost them when they stole from me. When they thought they could take what was mine, without a second thought. The satisfaction came from knowing that I had fought back. They could no longer pretend they hadn't stolen my future, and now they had to live with the consequences. Life moved on. I finished my 2-year degree and started a job as an engineering technician at a manufacturing company. I enrolled in evening classes for my bachelor's degree, paying as I went, without any debt hanging over my head. In the months that followed, I used some of the money from the lawsuit to take a vacation, a luxury I had never experienced growing up. I went to Colorado to hike and camp, a trip I had dreamed of for years but had never been able to afford. The sense of freedom was overwhelming. It was the first time in a long while I felt like I was living for myself. My parents, meanwhile, were struggling. They filed for bankruptcy. They lost their home. They were forced to downsize. They had to make hard choices, and I wasn't there to witness it. I had long since moved on. They would have to deal with the wreckage they had caused. I eventually heard that my parents and sisters had cut contact with each other. Victoria's marriage had fallen apart, and Lily was stuck in a toxic relationship with Brett. As for me, I was rebuilding my life on my terms. Aunt Janet invited me to Thanksgiving that year. She understood if I didn't want to come, but her kids would love to see me. I went, and for the first time in a long time, I experienced a real family holiday, no drama, no betrayal, just normal, genuine connection. My parents spent the holiday alone, in their small rental apartment. Neither of my sisters wanted to spend time with them, too wrapped up in their own mess to acknowledge the damage they had done. In the end, my lawsuit wasn't just about the money. It was about making sure they faced the consequences for their betrayal. It was about ensuring that my future, my education, wasn't taken away from me so that they could fund their lavish lifestyles. Now, at 25, I look back at everything I've accomplished. I've built a life on my own terms. I'm working toward my bachelor's degree. I have a stable job, real savings in the bank, and people in my life who value me for who I am, not for what I can give them. Sometimes people ask me if I regret suing my family. They ask if the money was worth losing them. I tell them the truth, I didn't lose my family by suing them. I lost them when they stole from me, laughed about it, and expected me to just accept it. The lawsuit was just the final step in ensuring that justice was served. Thank you for watching the video, like it if you watched the video to the end and don't forget to subscribe. Have a nice day.